the changes that we've seen during this pandemic, do we think they're going to be permanent? Or do we think that, you know, working from home is just going to be, you know, the pressure to go back, to be seen, to be in the office, you know, people missing the chit chat of the office? Do we think that this is going to be permanent, or do we think that we're just going to drift back? This is
on a trend, Susan, you know, in terms of having many different styles of working. And I think the home working thing has been, you know, going for about, I don't know, what, 10, maybe 15 years already, if not longer. And I think that will increase. I mean, it won't be as intense as it is now, but I think that you can't put the genie back in the bottle now. I think there'll be many more online meetings. We've all become experts, so-called, on Zoom and all the rest of it. We've had to learn new skills. And I think that, you know, that will carry on. But that's not the only thing. I think that there's lots of other examples of digital and artificial intelligence and so on that's being kind of pushed along and accelerated by the fact that we've been in a kind of lockdown situation for the best part of 3 months. So I think there's many things that will be different as a consequence of you know, this pandemic. And I think that they all play, I think, into the notion that Alison and Rebecca have made in their book, and the need for greater inclusive organizations and skills of collaboration and empathy and so on, in terms of you know, how our leaders need to be adapting in these situations.
I mean, one of the things that this mass forced experiment in home working has done, and I've heard a lot of people talking about this, is that because we have all suddenly seen into our co-workers, our teams' whole lives, we have a completely different sort of view of them, a different understanding of them. Whether it's, you know, the chaos of the chaos in the background, the kids running around, or that they have elderly parents that they're very worried about, or they've got pets that come and sit on their laps. I mean, all kinds of things. We have had a chance to see people's whole identities, and I think that this has really shifted things. I think it's created. And also because of the situation that we're all in, and we're all vulnerable to this, obviously to this crisis, just like we're all vulnerable to exclusion, but some people are much more vulnerable than others are. But I think this whole emphasis on being able to see the whole of our lives has created greater empathy, greater connection. And you know, a lot of leaders and managers. I mean, I'm not saying all of them by any chance. I'm sure that there have been some very bad examples as well. But I've really heard that a lot of people have been sort of, you know, being able to open up much more with their teams. You know, showing vulnerability as well as you know. So in other words, you can be strong and you can be a compassionate leader at the same time. So our whole notion of leadership, I mean, it was changing anyway. But again, I think this has accelerated it.
And to build on that, there's also a greater recognition and greater empathy, I think, for the essential nature of key workers who often overlap with marginalized groups and populations. And on a broad note, too, I think the situation is really highlighting the interconnections between sustainability and inclusion. They're interdependent, and you know, we really need that collective superpower to help businesses and society deal with the massive problems and complex challenges that we face, whether in business or society. And certainly, you know, COVID-19 is one of them right now.
Well, I'm just going to challenge you all a bit on that. I mean, I agree. You know, we are all seeing, you know, more human side of each other, and I said people are carefully curating their background. You know, I see the rest of my room. You'd see the piles of ironing not done. But also, you know, that some of this stuff that's happened. I mean, we've been seeing it reported in the press that actually, you know, some of that gender stereotyping is actually it's just there still. You know, women are still doing more of the housework, more of the child, you know, looking after the homeschooling. Now, there's maybe some sense to which, you know, women think they're doing it, but I mean, the IFS are saying this is that, you know, some of it is absolutely observable. Mm-hmm. So, you know, one of our audiences says he thinks these changes are permanent, and they are. but I think it shows, you know, what's happening in terms of some of those, you know, the roles that people take. You know, we seem to have gone a bit backward, you know, and so they're not as deeply embedded as we sometimes, you know, like to think. So, you know, just a bit of a challenge to you all there.
Well, I think if I can respond to that, Susan, it's a really great point. We are seeing a lot of traditional roles in households, perhaps where there are different genders in the household, with parents or caregivers, you know, taking on more traditional roles. And at the same time, they're also questioning those. And leaders are able to see that this doesn't really work out very well, that, you know, if childcare falls primarily on one partner, then, you know, that can interfere with the ability to get work done. But what I think we need to do is, again, think about what future do we want? And to find structures, you know, from regulations and from business processes and structures that will recognize that we're really basing our approaches to balancing childcare and healthcare on an outmoded sense of, you know, what it means to be kind of or kind of an old-fashioned model of, you know, there's a one person who takes care of the home and the children and one person who goes out to work. It's not true. It hasn't been true. But COVID is giving us a chance to kind of shine a spotlight on that and to say, what kind of future do we need to design and structure in so that this can be more effective going forward?
Sorry, Alison, yeah.
I was just going to say, I think it also really highlights, I mean, the trends that are going on in society right now, that really highlights how inclusion, what you do internally on inclusion is massively impacted by the environment, by the whole system around you, by the regulations, by the market conditions, by the expectations, legislation, environment, social, and so on. And so, as I mean, one of the other things that we've noticed that's happening is, unfortunately, is that you know, with the jobs crisis that's followed the COVID crisis, or that is following the COVID crisis, young people are disproportionately impacted by job loss, and amongst the young people, it's young women who are particularly impacted by job loss. So, if you're thinking about your inclusion strategy, you know, going forward, are you thinking about, you know, what is the impact of that, and how could you, as an inclusive company, as an inclusive employer, actually think creatively about, you know, who you want to hire into your organization and how that's being impacted by what's happening in society? And do you need to make, you know, a special effort actually to which a lot of companies are already doing, you know, to hire female talent, for example, or to hire, you know, particular groups like refugees is another example, you know, another example that we have in the book. Yeah.
So, you know, what do we think then are, you know, we've got there will be some significant change. We agreed on that, but there's still lots of challenges. So, you know, what do you think is, you know, what are the barriers that, you know, we've really got to overcome if we're really going to embed this whole agenda and have the you know, have the willpower and have the, you know, commitment from the top of firms to really drive this inclusivity agenda? You know, what's the key things we need to do? What are the key barriers we need to overcome?
There are a lot, but I think sort of three to emphasize might be that piecemeal approaches to inclusion do not work. And so we do need to take a more indivisible, whole system, strategic approach. Another thing is that we see it's very common in this field for organizations to just kind of replicate what are commonly called best practices, even when those best practices are inefficient and or ineffective. I misspoke when I said inefficient. I really mean ineffective. And I think the third thing is really that we have to make sure that it's very clear how inclusion is linked to the business. Part of the reason we see some organizations able to push ahead, even during COVID, to make advances with inclusion is because it's so tightly linked to what's mission critical for the organization to achieve. And that makes a huge difference in terms of whether or not organizations and their leaders and individual contributors see inclusion as a distraction or something optional, or whether it's just baked into how they're going to achieve what needs to be achieved for the business.
So I mean, this relates to one of the questions really. You know, someone was talking about, so it's Tommy again, talking about Harvard, you know, marking down Asian applicants on personality to keep breadth of demographic target. So, you know, we've seen what can go wrong, but, you know, let's just exchange some good news. You know, what happens when things go right? You know, so yeah, tell what does success look like? You know, use some practical case studies then to tell us what happens when we get this right.
Well, I could start with a case study, which is a Danish television company called TV2. That there is a slide if we just want to have a quick look at that. It's the picture of the front of the video. They've done a marketing campaign basically, which is called All That We Share. And if you are not aware of this already, I would highly recommend watching it. It's extremely touching, moving, and this is their second one actually. This is and basically they tell the story about how we have connections that we're not aware of between us, and extraordinary things that cross cultures, that cross you know, cross genders, that cross ages, and that cross all of our different identities. And it is very moving, and it's a very, very heartwarming message as well. And there are a couple of lessons from this particular case study. One is that in order to drive this sort of change, to create more inclusive work environments, you do need to both have the arguments, the touch people's heads, get to their heads, but the rational side of it. But you also need to touch people's hearts. You need to touch people's emotions. You need to show that human connection that we all have. And that certainly does it. But it wasn't, or I should say, and it wasn't just a nice, heartwarming message that the TV company sent out. It was actually directly connected with their business strategy. It was directly connected with their purpose to be a channel for everyone. And so the marketing part, which was incredibly inclusive, all about inclusion, was actually directly core to their business strategy, and it created had an incredible results for them. It went viral around the world. Viral is a word we'll have to rethink now, isn't it? And it went all over the world, and was repeated, viewed so many times, and it created $100 million worth of PR basically through the media coverage that it created. So it had a very positive result. It gave them an enormous profile, very, very positive reputation. So that's an example of how you can do it well if you really tie it into, and you can see the results, you can measure the result, and then you'll do it again because they just put out this other video, the second video, which is more of the same but extremely powerful stuff.
And actually, interestingly, I found various copycat versions. So, you know, it was quite interesting to see how it had spread. But yeah, I was watching a copycat before I even realised it. But anyway, yeah. David, what about you?
Examples. I mean, I think that actually, I was thinking of a bad example, and I just want to share it because one of the things about the COVID crisis, which has struck me and many others, is the lack of inclusiveness that countries have operated when they've managed their own kind of situation. It started with Italy when, you know, the European Union basically said, well, that's a really hard problem you've got, and didn't do much to help the situation in the early days. And it's carried on, I mean, to the point where, you know, we can't have we've got a global pandemic, but we don't seem to be able to come up with a common strategy on how to manage, you know, airlines and travel and that kind of thing. I saw that was one of the questions which got me thinking to our panelists here. about the ways we can get more collaboration going. I think I see lots of good examples in business. I'm not seeing so many good examples in terms of nation states and how they're operating, you know, in reference to this big ecosystem that we're operating in. What I'm seeing is more and more examples of companies recognizing that they've not just got to be inclusive within their organizations, but beyond the limits of their organizations, with their suppliers, with their customers, with their regulators, and so on, and being much more kind of open. I'm seeing plenty of examples of that. If I think about my old company, Unilever, and a lot of the supermarkets, for example, I see, yeah, of course, they still have some tensions, but I think that there's a lot of great work that goes on about how to make the whole supply chain more efficient, how to make sure that end customers get what they really want in a way that's sensible. And I've seen massive efforts going into that, which is great examples of inclusivity. But I'm disappointed not to see a bit more in terms of the way individual countries are managing the whole COVID pandemic.
It's a good point, David, and we're really challenging organizations and their leaders, but also nations and their leaders to break new ground. There is just overwhelming evidence that traditional approaches are not enough, and they leave out a lot of stakeholders, as David pointed out. So this whole system really works to address complex challenges, whether it's diversity and inclusion itself, whether it's COVID. We are seeing, as David said, more appetite, more momentum building around this idea that traditional piecemeal programmatic approaches just aren't enough. And they're looking for and starting to embrace a more systemic approach, not just in their mindset and their language, but how do we actually do this? Again, to kind of close that gap between the promise and practice of inclusion. And, you know, that's what this discussion and our work has been focused on helping.
Yeah, and another connection, which I mean, we see this as really sort of an emerging trend, of which is the interdependence. We highlight this is the interdependence between inclusion and sustainability, economic, social, and environmental sustainability. And investors are showing much greater interest in this area as well. They have, well, obviously for a very long time, they've been showing interest in the environmental part of it, the governance part of it. The social part of it perhaps has been a little bit in lacking, but I think we're seeing, as a result of the COVID crisis, much more focus actually on how well are employers doing with their workforces, and actually we think that will also sort of translate into how well are you doing with the people in your supply, in your supply chains, with us, your investors, with all of your external stakeholders as well. And we also can see that inclusion is very useful in that if you create inclusive processes to find the solutions to our biggest challenges, not only do you get really innovative solutions, but you also get much more buy-in on the part of the people who that's all of us who need to carry them out. So whether that's at grassroots level, whether that's organizational level, or whether it's actually cross-industry, working together. And there are some examples of companies that are collaborating to drive change, for example, in the tech sector, which are not just about internal, what happens, who you hire, and how fair your processes are internally, but also things like, tackling domestic abuse or discrimination in society. So it's kind of combining those two things, and that's where we think the most pioneering companies, the leading companies, are going to lead the way. And we're very much wanting to see that and wanting to help that happen.
Absolutely.
Wanting to support that.
Yeah. So David, we're into our final moments, are we not?
Yes, we are into our final moment. We have 2 minutes before the scheduled finish time.
Okay, so let's just ask the panelists then. It's going to be we're in a strange world. Survival is, actually going to be really important to people. So, when they're thinking about that though, and they're thinking about moving forward, you know, what's the key, you know, point that you'd all like people to take away from this webinar? Rebecca, let's go to you first.
Well, inclusion requires a whole system approach, and it must be integral to business strategy and to sustainability writ large.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. David?
Companies need to be more adaptive and innovative, and they need to harness the superpower of all their people.
Yeah. And Alison?
Well, I'd just like to say that inclusion must be indivisible from the way the whole organization operates.
Yeah. So if we get this right, we can, you know, really harness that creativity of people. We can really get that sense of engagement that they bring. At the moment, you know, we're only touching the surface, aren't we? For a lot of people, they're not really bringing that creativity to the workforce, or only a small percentage of, as indeed our little poll showed, you know, earlier on. So thank you very much, everyone.
May I just ask a quick question? Because we haven't been able to answer all the questions. We would be very, very happy to, you know, to answer people's questions, or if they want to connect with us afterwards. We did just have a last slide with our, you know, with our contacts on it. So if anybody does want to follow up with us, and thank you for your questions and the interaction as well on all parts.
Yes, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I think it's been a very lively and interesting and informative session. As you can see, there are some contact points on the screen that you see at the moment. Also, this event has been recorded and it will be published sometime in the next few days. If there are any questions that we haven't dealt with during this session, there will be an opportunity, I think, in the IORMA blog to respond to some of those questions and provide answers with you. As you leave the session this afternoon, you will be invited to complete a poll, give your feedback on how you found this session and whether you're interested in more information about IORMA, or indeed whether you're interested in IORMA hosting a webinar themselves. So for me, as Virtual Conference Director of IORMA, I really just want to thank Susan for moderating the session today, and for our expert panelists for their contribution and wise words. I found it particularly interesting, and I'm sure from the comments and from the questions that we've had today, this is something that is shared by all the panelists. So thank you very much once again. Now I'm going to close the session down, and